For generations, long before Nevada became a state, and decades before two miners made a discovery that would ignite one of the strangest debates in American archaeology, the northern Paiute people preserved an extraordinary tradition. They spoke of an enemy unlike any other, not a neighboring tribe or a band of raiders, but a people remembered as different in appearance, different in behavior, and feared across the region. According to the Paiute, these people had reddish hair, lived among the tule reeds of the marshes, and were remembered not as spirits or legends, but as a real enemy their ancestors fought for many years. The tradition even described exactly how the conflict ended. The last of them, the elders said, were trapped inside a cave, and that cave was sealed with fire. Then, in 1911, two miners digging for bat guano in a remote Nevada hillside broke into a cavern filled with ancient artifacts, woven sandals, mummified remains, and according to the reports that followed, human hair that appeared unmistakably red. The story spread across the country. Then, like so many stories of its kind, the details began to scatter. More than a century later, one question remains. Did those miners stumble into an ordinary archaeological site that legend later attached itself to? Or had they opened the very cave the Paiute had been describing all along? Today, we're examining the historical records, the Paiute oral traditions, and the events surrounding one of the most debated discoveries ever made in the Great Basin. To understand why the Lovelock cave story continues to fascinate people more than a century later, we have to begin much earlier. Long before miners arrived, long before archaeologists surveyed the site, and long before newspapers printed a single word about giants, the Paiute were already telling a story about the people of the Tules. For the northern Paiute, this was never simply a campfire tale. It was part of their history. Their oral traditions describe a people they called the Sitaka, a name usually translated as Tule eaters, because these people were said to live among the Tule reeds that grew thick around the marshes and lakes of what is now western Nevada. According to the traditions, the Sitaka did not live like the Paiute. They were remembered as hostile, as raiders, and in the most unsettling versions of the story, as cannibals who preyed upon the surrounding peoples. And nearly all versions agree on one striking physical detail. Their hair was red. What makes this tradition especially valuable to historians is that it was written down early, and it was written down by a remarkable source. In 1883, a Paiute woman named Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins published a book titled Life Among the Paiutes. She was the daughter of Chief Winnemucca and the granddaughter of Chief Truckee, and her book is recognized today as one of the first works ever published by a Native American woman. In it, she recorded the tradition her own family had carried. She described a long war between her ancestors and a small tribe of people who were unlike the Paiute, a conflict that her people said lasted for years. And she described how it ended. The last of the enemy, she wrote, took refuge inside a cave. The Paiute gathered wood at the entrance and demanded they come out. When they refused, the entrance was set alight, and the people inside never emerged. Hopkins even wrote that her family possessed a garment trimmed with the reddish hair of these people, passed down as proof of what had happened. Here is the detail that matters most for everything that follows. That book was published in 1883. The discovery at Lovelock Cave would not happen for another 28 years. Whatever anyone believes about the tradition, no one can claim it was invented after the fact. The story of a red-haired enemy destroyed by fire inside a cave was already sitting in print, decades before anyone put a shovel into the floor of that cavern. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through historical records, archaeology, and indigenous traditions, consider subscribing. Because what those miners found in 1911 didn't just resemble an ordinary cave site. It contained details that seemed strangely familiar to anyone who had read what the Paiute had been saying all along. In the spring of 1911, two men named David Pugh and James Hart were working a claim in the Humboldt Range of western Nevada, not far from the small town of Lovelock. They were not archaeologists, and they were not looking for artifacts. They were mining bat guano, which at the time was a valuable commercial fertilizer. The cave they entered, a large rock shelter set into the hillside above the dry bed of ancient Lake La Hontan, held guano deposits several feet deep, built up over thousands of years. The miners began stripping it out by the ton, and records indicate that roughly 250 tons of material were eventually shipped out for processing. But as they dug deeper into the cave floor, the miners began encountering things that had no business in a fertilizer operation. Woven baskets, sandals made from plant fiber, tools, netting, and human remains, some of them naturally mummified by the dry desert air. The deeper they dug, the more material appeared. Much of it, unfortunately, was treated as debris. Artifacts were reportedly broken, discarded, burned as fuel, or carried off by visitors. By the time anyone with scientific training arrived, an unknown quantity of the cave's contents had already been lost forever. To understand what the miners had walked into, it helps to picture what this landscape looked like in the deep past. Today, the region around Lovelock is dry, a country of sagebrush, alkali flats, and distant ranges. But during the last ice age, much of western Nevada lay beneath the waters of Lake La Hontan, an enormous inland sea covering thousands of square miles. As the climate warmed, the Great Lake slowly retreated, leaving behind a chain of shrinking marshes, wetlands, and shallow lakes, including the Humboldt Sink below the cave. For the ancient people of this region, those wetlands were everything. They provided fish, waterfowl, and the tool reeds from which nearly every object of daily life could be woven. The people archaeologists would later call the Lovelock culture built their entire world from those marshes. A cave in the hillside above such a wetland was not a remote shelter. It was prime real estate, and it was used for thousands of years. Word of the discoveries eventually reached the University of California, and in 1912 a researcher named Llewellyn L. Loud traveled to the site and began the first organized excavation. He returned in 1924, this time working alongside Mark Raymond Harrington of the Museum of the American Indian. Together, their work at Lovelock Cave recovered an extraordinary collection, ultimately numbering in the thousands of artifacts. Their findings were published in 1929 in a formal report, and that report remains one of the foundational documents of Great Basin archaeology. And some of what they found was genuinely remarkable by any standard. Buried within the cave deposits was a cache of duck decoys, woven from tool reeds and painted, so carefully constructed that they remain recognizable as canvasback ducks even today. Decades later, radiocarbon testing dated them to roughly 2,000 years old, making them among the oldest duck decoys ever discovered anywhere in the world. Several are now held in museum collections, including the Smithsonian. Whoever used this cave was skilled, organized, and present for a very long time. Occupation layers suggested people had been using the site for thousands of years. Then the story became stranger, because alongside the baskets and the decoys and the tools, there were the human remains. And this is where the historical record splits into two very different versions of events. According to newspaper accounts from the period, some of the remains recovered from the cave and from the surrounding area were unusual. Reports describe mummified bodies of exceptional size, with some articles claiming heights of well over 6 feet, and later retellings inflating those figures to 8 feet, 9 feet, and beyond. Other reports fixed on the hair. Strands and patches recovered with the remains were described as distinctly red or reddish-brown. Stories circulated of enormous woven sandals, with one frequently repeated account describing a sandal roughly 15 inches long. To readers who knew the Paiute tradition, the implication was irresistible. The red-haired people of the legend had been found, exactly where the legend said they died. But then, something familiar happened. The sensational claims and the physical evidence began drifting apart. Many of the remains reportedly recovered in the early mining period were never scientifically documented at all. Some were said to have been lost, discarded, or scattered into private hands. The artifacts that did enter museum collections were cataloged, but the most dramatic items described in newspapers, the giant skeletons, could not be located or verified in the decades that followed. What remained was a genuine archaeological site of real importance, surrounded by a cloud of claims that no one could fully confirm and no one could fully erase. As interest in the story grew, researchers began asking the obvious questions. And to be fair to the historical record, the skeptical answers are substantial. Anthropologists who examined remains connected with the Lovelock area reported that they fell within the normal range of human height. The tallest individuals described in credible documentation were tall, certainly, but not giants. Around 6 feet, not 8 or 9. The red hair had a possible explanation as well. Hair pigment is not stable after death. Dark hair can turn reddish over centuries through oxidation and the chemistry of burial conditions, a phenomenon documented in mummified remains around the world. In other words, Ancient remains with reddish hair do not require a race of red-haired strangers. Time alone can produce them. Even the Paiute tradition itself has been re-examined. Some scholars have argued that the descriptions in the oral accounts referred to enemies who wore red pigment, or that the word giants entered the story later, added by settlers and newspapermen, rather than by the Paiute themselves. Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, it's worth noting, never actually called them giants in her book. She called them a small tribe of barbarians. The giants came later, in headlines. For many historians, that is enough to close the case. A real cave, a real ancient people, a real oral tradition, and a layer of exaggeration stitched over all of it by the early 20th century press. But others argue the situation is not quite so simple, because when you strip away every inflated claim and keep only what is documented, an uncomfortable core remains. The tradition of a red-haired enemy destroyed by fire in a cave was published in 1883. The cave was opened in 1911. The excavations were real. The mummified remains were real. Reddish hair was recovered and described by people who handled it, and the cave itself showed the marks of ancient burning, with fire-affected material noted within its deposits. Though archaeologists attribute burning in such sites to many ordinary causes, including campfires, torches, and accidental blazes over thousands of years of occupation, none of those parallels prove that the legend describes literal history. They do not prove that the people buried at Lovelock were the Siteka of tradition, but they raise an important historical question. Could two completely different sources, one an oral tradition recorded in 1883 and the other an excavation conducted in the decades after 1911, be pointing toward the same events remembered in two different ways? Consider how the pieces align. The tradition describes a people who lived among the tools. The cave deposits were filled with tool artifacts, tool sandals, tool decoys, tool matting, the material culture of a marsh-dwelling people who lived on the shores of the ancient lake. The tradition describes a final refuge inside a cave. The site is a cave, used and occupied across an immense span of time. The tradition describes red hair. Red hair, whatever its cause, is what the miners and excavators described recovering. The tradition describes fire at the entrance. Fire, from whatever source, left its traces in the deposits. Each of these details has a conventional explanation. All of them together are why the story has never fully died. There is also the matter of what was lost. This is the part of the Lovelock story that even the strictest skeptics acknowledge with regret. The guano miners removed and destroyed an enormous portion of the cave's contents before any scientist arrived. Whatever lay in those upper layers, whatever was burned, dumped, or carried away between 1911 and 1912, is gone. Archaeology can only study what survives. And at Lovelock Cave, the record was torn open by shovels and shipped out by the ton before the first careful excavation ever began. When people ask why the most sensational claims cannot be verified, that is part of the honest answer. Verification requires evidence, and much of the evidence was destroyed in the first year, and the story refused to stay in the past. For decades, visitors to the small Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca, Nevada, reported seeing human skulls said to have come from the Lovelock area, displayed alongside artifacts from the cave. Accounts of their size varied wildly depending on who was telling the story, and the remains were eventually removed from public display, as museums across the country reconsidered the exhibition of Native American remains under modern law and ethics. Whatever those skulls could or could not have proven, they became one more piece of the legend, seen by some, described by many, and examined scientifically in ways that satisfied almost no one. Meanwhile, the cave itself was designated a protected archaeological site, its entrance still visible in the hillside, its floor long since emptied of nearly everything it once held. More than a century has passed since Pugh and Hart broke into that cavern above the Humboldt sink. During those years, the duck decoys have traveled to museum display cases and been dated by modern laboratories. The Loudon-Harrington report has been studied by generations of archaeologists. The Great Basin has become one of the most carefully researched regions in North American prehistory, revealing a deep human story stretching back more than 10,000 years. Yet despite all of that work, the story attached to Lovelock Cave has never completely disappeared. It continues to return because it asks a question that has never been answered in a way that satisfies everyone. If the giants were pure newspaper invention, why does the documented tradition, published decades before the discovery, align so closely with what the cave actually contained? And if the tradition preserves a real memory, why has no verified physical evidence of a distinct people ever been confirmed? History has not provided a definitive answer. Instead, it has left us with fragments. An 1883 memoir written by a chief's daughter, a guano mine that became an excavation, a formal archaeological report, museum drawers holding 2,000-year-old decoys, newspaper clippings full of claims that grew taller with every retelling, and a tradition that the Paiute preserved long before any of it was written down. That is where history and memory meet. The Paiute account does not replace archaeology, and archaeology does not prove every detail of the Paiute account. But together they remind us of something historians have learned again and again. The past is rarely preserved in a single place. Sometimes it survives in the ground. Sometimes it survives in old documents. And sometimes it survives because generation after generation continued telling a story long after the people who lived it were gone. Whether the Siteka were a distinct people whose memory survived in Paiute tradition, or an enemy band whose story slowly transformed over centuries of retelling, or something in between, is a question we may never fully answer. What we do know is that the cave exists. The artifacts are real. The tradition was recorded before the discovery, not after it. And the people who lived and died in the marshes of ancient Lake Lahontan left behind one of the richest archaeological records in the Great Basin. Perhaps that's why this mystery continues to fascinate so many people. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it reminds us how much of the ancient world has been lost, not only beneath the soil, but in the layers of a cave shoveled out for fertilizer, and in the memories that faded before they could ever be written down. History is often imagined as a complete story. In reality, it's more like a puzzle with missing pieces. Every excavation uncovers another clue. Every forgotten record adds another fragment. And every oral tradition preserves a voice that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Lovelock Cave remains one of those unfinished puzzles, a place where archaeology, indigenous memory, and early 20th century records intersect, leaving us with a mystery that is still being debated today.